Welcome back to Missing. I am Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. Thank you so much for asking. I hope all the listeners are doing fantastic as well. The guests that we have on, two guests that we have on, we really went through a little bit of a technical battle before having them on, and we totally appreciate their time and working with us as we finally were able to speak with them. And we're so grateful that we were, because the topic that we're covering is one that I don't think you and I had on our radar. And it's always great when we have guests come on and introduce to us a new true crime topic. But Tim, before we get to that, introduce to me and the listeners how you're doing.
I am doing great over here. Thanks for asking. And yes, this is a fascinating conversation with two great guests, the authors of the new book, The Babydoll Serial Killer, the John Eric Armstrong Homicides, Murders in the Motor City series, book 1. So B.R. Bates is one of the authors. She has said that she's going to keep writing these Murders in the Motor City books. And our other guest is Gerald Cliff, who wrote the book with her. And Gerald is former law enforcement and worked on the case of serial killer John Eric Armstrong.
Gerald was part of a group called the Violent Crimes Section, which is a department within law enforcement that takes over cases when the previously assigned section, when it goes outside of the scope of the previously assigned section. So it runs anywhere from like IRS to this particular series of serial killings that John Eric Armstrong perpetrated. So that kind of says something about the mentality of Gerald and those that he worked with. And he had stated that shortly after being assigned this case, after discovering those 3 bodies, they quickly apprehended their suspect, who was subsequently convicted and is currently serving a life sentence for these series of murders.
Yeah, so John Eric Armstrong committed anywhere from 5 to 11 murders as cited online, and he was arrested because of this dump site that he had. And he returned to as a necrophiliac. So it's pretty dark stuff. It's a wild story, and really, I wish we had more time with BR and Gerald to discuss. But maybe we'll have them back on.
Yeah, I really hope we have them back on. And Tim, I want to take a moment and remind our listeners that we do these final thoughts at the end of our episodes now. And this is a perfect example of us having final thoughts because we were working on a time crunch and we didn't get to ask or make the observations that we wanted to during. So I am really looking forward to our final thoughts for this episode because I have a ton of just considerations, not questions, just considerations about John Eric Armstrong and whether he would have been a different person if certain things didn't happen in his childhood.
Very good. Always an interesting conversation. Okay, I hope you enjoy the interview with BR and Gerald, and you can pick up the Babydoll Serial Killer book from Wild Blue Press, wherever you get your books. There are links in the show notes. Please follow us on social media at MissingCSM.
And we'll be right back after a quick break with B.R. Bates and Gerald Cliff.
B.R. Bates and Gerald Cliff, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Thank you. Doing well. Thanks for the opportunity.
Doing great. Thanks.
For those out there who do not know who the two of you are, maybe we could start with BR and then move to Gerald. Can you fill in the audience who you are and what brings you to the show?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm a longtime writer. I have a journalism background. I have worked in the newspaper industry, graduated from Michigan State University School of Journalism with a bachelor's degree in journalism and a dual major of English, and went into the newspaper field, worked in newspapers in Wausau, Wisconsin, and Saginaw, Michigan, and Detroit, Michigan at the Detroit News, which is where I was working at the time of the Armstrong case. And then since then, I went into the corporate world for quite a few years, and nowadays I manage websites for a federal government agency part-time while I am working on my writing projects.
I'm Jerry Cliff, to my friends. Retired police officer from city of Detroit. I retired to the rank of commander. I was the officer in charge of the violent crime section at the time this case took place. Since leaving Detroit, I was chief of police in Saginaw, Michigan for almost 8 years. Worked 6 years as the research director at the National White Collar Crime Center down south in West Virginia. After that, I did about 1.5 years as a consultant working on a consent decree with the City of Albuquerque Police Department. Right now, I'm completely unemployed and just enjoying not having to work for a living.
Very cool. Well, welcome to the show and congrats on the new book. It is great. The Babydoll Serial Killer, the John Eric Armstrong Homicides. Can you tell us about the decision to write this book?
Yeah, that's an easy one. Jerry and I did not know each other at the time, but we had a mutual friend. And I think Jerry had told our mutual friend, I covered this case in Detroit back in the day where I always thought it would make a good book project. And Jerry had files from the case that he carried around to and fro as he moved around. Myself, I was telling our mutual friend, I can't get enough of true crime. I'm like watching the Forensic Files shows, the Dateline NBC, those type of shows on ID and Oxygen and whatever. And I didn't always like true crime, but in recent years, I've eaten it up. And I always, I think, was interested in perhaps taking on a case like that or a project like that, a book project like that. Everything else I've written in my writing career has been very different. I've been concentrated in the pop culture genre for most of my writing career. And so this is definitely a huge departure. But our mutual friend introduced the two of us and we talked about the case. And then it evolved into a very big research project and a very fulfilling one too.
For me, I had just been promoted to the executive ranks in November of '99 and placed in charge of the violent crime section, which it was the chief's go-to unit when something hit the department that was a little bit more than, say, homicide might want to take on, or any of the other major units in the Major Crimes Investigative Division. Violent crime section was cooperative. We had FBI agents, IRS agents, state police detectives, county police detectives from the sheriff's department. We were basically a borderless law enforcement agency, and we were able to take on any crime that was significant enough that we felt that it might be a little bit too much for just a city department to handle, even one the size of Detroit. So it kind of landed on my desk like a nuclear weapon 2 weeks after I was appointed, and it stuck with me just because of I actually had the opportunity to sit back and watch this incredible unit of investigators work together like a well-oiled machine and actually get this guy in custody. We had him in 41 hours from the time we first got the files and found the body. So bodies, I should say. I copied everything. I saved it with the intention that someday when I retired and didn't have anything else to do, I was going to write a book about it. And when the time came, I realized that I still write like a cop. So when our mutual friend introduced me to Billy Ray and we talked about it, we decided it was the partnership that had to work on this.
Cool. And this is just book one in your series. How many books are you planning for this?
Well, at least two, perhaps a third. And the second one is going to be on another Detroit serial killer who operated a few years before Armstrong did in the early 1990s in Detroit, in a slightly different area of downtown Detroit. But there are a few other serial killers. If you just talk about Detroit serial killers, there are a few others that would actually make good book projects too. So who knows?
So we're at least guaranteed two more appearances on our show from the both of you. So we look forward to that. I want to revisit the violent crime section that you were a part of, Gerald. what type of, I don't know, like chemical makeup does one have to be considered to be in this department? Because to reach a level of any, I don't know, status in law enforcement is impressive, but to be the section of law enforcement that takes over when others can't, bring it past the goal line, that has to, include something pretty special.
Well, everybody that was in that unit was special in my estimation. Detroit was one of the first unionized police departments in the country, and to get a transfer from one section to another, you put in a transfer request, and it was determined based on your seniority on that list as to whether or not an opening came up. If you were the top senior person, you got transferred in. Well, the union was, I guess you would say, negotiated with in this situation. And it was explained to them that we have cases that come across our desk, and we have to have the ability to throw the best of the best at it. And we, for that reason, were allowed, I guess you would say, to forego the normal transfer process and basically cherry pick our best investigators from all over the department. The FBI assigned us several full-time agents to work with us, and all of our people were vetted by the FBI and given full background checks, so we had access to every facility that they had. As I said, we had an IRS agent working with us. We had a state attorney general's detective assigned into us from Lansing. We had a state police lieutenant, again, the best of the best. And that was the criteria. And you had to have a work record that distinguished you from the rest of your coworkers in order to even be considered. And one of the things my boss used to like to do is he would let kind of the rank and file do the pre-employment or pre-transfer interview, and you had to fit, was basically what it came down to. And it was a place for workaholics. There were days I'd go in on a Tuesday morning and not get home until Thursday night because our boss was a fanatic. If there were leads to be followed and the criminal was still out there, we were still working it. And if we had to go on 12-hour round-the-clock shifts, we would do that. But I can tell you for a fact, I personally worked something like 72 straight hours on another case without going home. So it was an exciting place to work.
It's a lot like podcasting. Just kidding.
Okay, so can you tell us about this case, sort of how it unfolded to you? And also just wondering what kind of victims this guy went after.
They say that prostitutes have been pretty easy targets since the beginning of time, since the days of Jack the Ripper, unfortunately. And this was yet another serial killer who preyed on women at risk, living on the street, basically existing on the street. And so that is who Armstrong hunted. He hunted in an area of Detroit on Michigan Avenue, which is a pretty thriving area of prostitution in Detroit, one of several areas in Detroit that have a lot of prostitution, a lot of strip clubs, a lot of that whole drug culture, all of that. And so those are the women that he sought, unfortunately. But Jerry, tell him how the story unfolded.
Every Monday morning, the department heads, myself, the commanding officer of the Homicide Division, the commanding officer of Special Investigations, would meet with our boss, who would be, I guess you would say, the chief of detectives, although we didn't use that term, the commanding officer of the Homicide Section, the commanding officer of the Special Investigations Division, which was sex crimes, child abuse, armed robbery, commercial auto theft. He had the biggest of the investigative sections. We would all meet in our boss's office. Our boss would be, I guess you'd call him the equivalent of the chief of detectives, although we didn't use that term in Detroit. And we would brief him on where everything was, going as far as our major investigations. During that meeting, this is back in the days of pagers. The head of the homicide division, his pager went off, and he got up to answer the phone. And they paused the meeting briefly, and he came back and he says, "We have a dead body out at John Cronkin Railroad tracks. We got a crew heading out there, no big deal." And I mean, not to diminish the fact somebody's dead, but it's that happened to Detroit. That we enjoyed in those days the title murder capital of the world. So it wasn't unusual. I'll put it that way. So we resumed the meeting, and about 5 minutes later, we get he gets another page. He gets up, he answers the phone. He says, "There's 2 bodies at that location." And now our boss is beginning to take a little bit more notice. And while the homicide commander is still on the phone, he says, "Make that 3." And now the meeting's permanently on hold, and our boss is really interested, and he's going, "Tell us more." And the boss of the homicide division says, "And they appear to be in varying states of decomposition. I think we've got a problem." Well, now it's all hands on deck. The boss stands up. He says, "Everybody get your coats on. We're going out to the west side." And that's where we went. We got out there and we found, I guess you would call it a dump site. There was one female body next to railroad tracks in full view. And off the rail bed, there was a big depression in the ground there that was pretty well overgrown. And down in that depression, we found a second and then a third. The one that was in full view looked to have been only a couple of days old. The first one that we found looked to be maybe 2 weeks old. The one further down could have been a month and a half old. You could actually see bones beginning to show through the skin, and it was kind of gruesome. So at that point, our boss, and we all realized that we had obviously a serial killer, and we'd stumbled onto a dump site.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
So what's your protocol at that point? Because I'm assuming there's several of you there. You're looking at it. You've sort of, I guess, prepared yourself as much as you can as you approach it without seeing any bodies yet. But once you see those bodies and you're all kind of collectively but silently thinking these are probably related, what's your first move? Like, what do you initiate?
Well, the first thing, topic of discussion was this is obviously a serial killer. The victims were all posed in pretty much the same manner. They were all stripped of their clothing, from the waist down, posed in such a way with their legs spread wide open. They'd all obviously been strangled. We knew that there was enough similarity here that under any consideration, we would have to say that they were all killed in the same way by the same person. So the first thing my boss did, because like I said, we did have FBI agents assigned to our group, he called the ASAC from the Detroit office, told them we've got a big problem. We've got what looks to be a serial killer. Explained the situation. He said, "We want to talk to the behavioral analysis unit from Quantico. We want to get them out here before we move anywhere in terms of the crime scene, so we don't lose any evidence, and we need advice." So the ASAC put us immediately in touch with the behavioral analysis unit, I think they called it back in those days. We explained the situation, explained the scene as good as we could, and told them we will, if necessary, hold the scene as long as it takes for you to get here from DC or from Quantico, Virginia. They thought that was a bit extreme, didn't necessarily have to happen that way. They said, "No, go ahead and process the scene the way you normally would, and we'll advise you." So they did. They advised us that, yeah, it does sound very, very much like you've got a serial killer on your hands. And the conversation went on for quite a while, but the upshot of the whole thing was they summarized it. They said, "Don't concentrate on his successes, concentrate on his failures. Somewhere out there is somebody who got away, someone who he tried to kill and managed to get free, or someone he tried to overcome and managed to survive, someone that he thought he had killed, strangled, and that really wasn't dead. And they were right. So it was, like I said, all hands on deck. We put, at that time, probably close to 200 detectives to work, combing the streets looking for anybody that could give us information about any of the three victims, anybody that they had come in contact with, and sure enough, we found some. We found a couple, and from there we got a physical description, pretty good physical description, a description of a vehicle, and we went from there.
That is a really great starting point, I think, for approaching the investigation, where you were told don't focus on what this person did right, focus on what they did wrong, because I'm sure you can get caught up in just sort of the gravity of the situation. And this is a terrible word to use, but to get caught up in how impressive it is, and impressive is not a good word to use, but there's an impression it makes, and you can't get too caught up in that.
Well, it made an impression on me. So that was the first incident like that I'd ever encountered in a career of almost 25 years in Detroit. So
wow, so pretty rare scene for you all. What was next? What happened next? What was the break in the case?
Well, like I said, we encountered one of his attempted victims. Turned out not to be a female. It turned out to be a male in female clothing, and he wasn't. I think he was as surprised as anybody when he tried to perform his acts of depravity on a man instead of a woman that had a little bit more physical strength and was able to break free and get away. We also found one female walking the street, a prostitute, that had been attacked, and she managed to get away. From that, we got descriptions of a large, tall white male, red hair, wearing a work shirt with a name on it, on the pocket, Eric, and a blue Jeep. Well, from that point, it's fairly simple. You put out the information as to who you're looking for, and we had, like I said, we had surveillance units all over that precinct watching for the blue Jeep, watching for anybody that matched that description. We were fairly certain that he didn't know that we were aware of him, and even if he was, he didn't seem to be all that careful about it. With just, discarding bodies and leaving one in plain view. It was almost like he didn't intend to get away with it forever. He expected to get caught, and there's a lot of speculation that that's the case, that he really did expect to get caught, and his activity was escalating, I guess you would say, as a psychologist put it. In retrospect, people that have analyzed the case say that that's kind of characteristic of a serial killer. They get careless as their proclivities tend to mount, and they begin to give in more and more to their urges to rape and kill. So once we had the information we needed, we put it out on a teletype. We broadcast it on the radio, and everybody in the department was looking for the blue Jeep, was looking for the red-headed white male driving it, and it didn't take long to find him. And like I said, we flooded the streets with surveillance units looking for him.
And the individual that we're talking about is John Eric Armstrong, and you mentioned that he was behaving in a way that was escalating but reckless, so it seemed like he might have expected to get caught. And I think I read somewhere that he had described himself as having some, especially his upbringing, he had an inferiority complex. BR, when you were looking into this and you started to learn about him, what were some of your initial first impressions?
Well, the biggest impression, talking to people who knew him, in grade school, who knew him as a teenager, who worked with him in Detroit in later years, and who served with him in the U.S. Navy in the 1990s, there seemed to be a common theme of the boy next door. Very unassuming, very innocent seeming. He would put anyone at ease as he's talking to you. So definitely A lot of people were shocked at his arrest, never would have believed that he was capable of being a killer, let alone a serial killer. And so he struck people that way. When he was serving in the Navy, he was aboard the USS Nimitz, and his shipmates called him Opie, after the character in classic TV, the redheaded character. And he just seemed so innocent in that way, like such a sweet boy. One of the gals who worked with him in Detroit at the store where he worked called him the boy next door, and also took on like a motherly view of him and just thought he was a very sweet boy. I never would have believed this of him. So that was his persona. And it's actually still, I can tell you, a persona that maintains to this day. If you meet him right now in prison, he will actually strike you the same way. It's crazy.
But he didn't have that positive of a childhood or an upbringing. In 1979, I feel like 1979 was a bad year for him, even at 5 years old. Can you get into his childhood and his upbringing a little bit?
Yeah. When he was a little boy, I think he was about 5 years old when he got a baby brother. And he loved his baby brother very much. He doted on him. It was very close to him. But his baby brother died in the crib. And shortly after that, his biological father left the family. And so adding those things up, I think he considers his childhood pretty traumatic. There may have been other things going on there that we don't know. But his father leaving, and then he got a stepfather a few years later. I think it all was a difficult adjustment. His mother, at the time of Armstrong's arrest in April 2000, his mother told the media that he had tried to ride his bicycle out into traffic as a little boy. And with the thought, at least she felt, he had the thought of joining his baby brother because he missed his baby brother so much. And they had a family Bible, and he wrote his baby brother's name in it multiple times. Just seemed to be very traumatized by the loss of his baby brother. And he made allegations later at the time of his arrest. He made allegations about his biological father, which actually I don't believe are true based on everybody else I've spoken to. I think that was something he probably said at his arrest to maybe justify or provide some kind of rationale for this whole crazy situation. But he made allegations. And so there was stuff there. We don't really know all of the details around it, but he may, in the case of nature versus nurture, it's always a very difficult question, but I think it probably could be a mix of both for him. There may have been things going on in his childhood that had an influence in a negative way for him, but I just also have to wonder if there's a brain chemistry thing going on with him and some of these other killers. You know, a lot of people argue that point too.
Yeah, quite traumatic upbringing and sort of a relationship with death from early on, I would say.
Yes.
Now, at what point did his front license plate become known to authorities?
Well, okay. He was discharged from the Navy in 1998, I think, 1998, actually 1999. He did serve until like maybe the spring of 1999. He and his wife, they had met on the ship and gotten married, and they were living in Norfolk, Virginia, where the Nimitz came into port, and it was docked there for a while for maintenance or whatever. And so they lived in Virginia for a while, and then they moved to Michigan in 1999 because her family is from Metro Detroit, Michigan. And so they came to Michigan to live with her family and start a new life here. And at that point, actually in 1999, he bought a new Jeep, and then brought that to Michigan with him, and had a plate on the front of the Jeep that said Babydoll. And that was a nickname that he and his wife shared. And so just kind of a playful nickname that I believe from all of my research that they had for each other. So yeah, very, like I said, unassuming, sweet seeming boy with a Babydoll plate on the front of his Jeep.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
How does somebody mask that clear division in their behavior? I mean, we talk about serial killers all the time, but I guess from both of you can give your opinions on this, but how do you come across as like, oh, the aw shucks guy, and also, I mean, you're positioning bodies in such a way where they're provocative and, you know, disgusting and disturbing. I just don't understand this.
I mean, I think that they say serial killers have to, all serial killers, I would think to a certain degree, live a double life. They're able to become masters at compartmentalizing the areas of their life, because this was a family man. Armstrong had a wife and he had a toddler son at the time that these crimes were happening. And by all accounts, his wife had no idea this was going on. That was crazy. And so you're living two different lives, and you're living the life of the guy who's working at the store and smiling at people. And he would be just any woman's idea of a perfect son, you know, like the woman who worked with him at the store thought of him as the son, and just was so sweet and struck people that way. But at the same time, any of those women that he was picking up on Michigan Avenue, they, you know, I guess they were disarmed. They were disarmed by his demeanor, I'm sure. But then he turned and there was a totally different man, I think, sitting next to them in the Jeep, which is very, very chilling to think about. But yeah, what do you think, Jerry?
I agree. I think there were indications going back, and like I say, in retrospect, that there were two personalities going on there. When we first got the car stopped that he was in, and were actually placing him under arrest, he was heard to say, "Thank God it's finally over." So I think he realized at some level what was going on, you know, that he was compelled, I guess you would say, psychologically to commit these kind of crimes. But at the same time, he knew they were wrong. And yet at the same time, he was manipulative, very manipulative. When we had him in our headquarters, the city jail, of course, we have to take him across the street to the recorder's court for hearings and whatnot. And there's the thing that you see on television called the perp walk. Well, that's necessitated by the fact that the two buildings are separate, because we had a press conference to announce that we had discovered we had a serial killer. There was also a press conference to announce that we were arrested him. So the media was all there. Everybody was agog over this, the capture of this guy in such a short period of time, and what a unique event it had been. We hadn't had a serial killer in Detroit for 10 years at this point, almost, or 9. And he made a request. He said, he asked if he could have a teddy bear to carry over to court. My boss about had a calf. He said, absolutely not. He's posing for the press. He wants to prep the court for an insanity plea. He knows exactly what he's doing. And that was the case. We told him there's no way, you know, there's just no way it's going to happen. And he just kind of shrugged his shoulders and, okay. And he went on about his business. But that was kind of my clue that deep down inside, he knew what he was doing was wrong, and that he just was giving in to these urges that he was having. And at one point, I asked him personally during the interviews, because the reason that he was posing these women and the reason that he was keeping the bodies for a prolonged period of time before he disposed of them is because he was a necrophiliac. And I would ask him, I asked him out of curiosity, I said, Eric, I understand what you were doing. And what made you decide after a period with one of these victims that it was time for a new one? And he just very matter-of-factly said, well, when I couldn't get in the house without my wife smelling dead on me, I knew it was time for a new one. That kind of shocked me a little bit after 25 years in the big city. I'm going, well, oh, okay. You know, how matter-of-factly he said it and how common sense it sounded. from his perspective, that when he wasn't sure he could get away with not being discovered by his wife, it was time to find a new victim. And that's when he would toss the old one down the gully into the weeds and go find a new victim.
And that's why he did position the bodies the way he positioned them, was so that he could go back and have intercourse with them?
Yep.
And how close were these bodies to his residence?
He lived in Dearborn Heights, which is a suburb of western area of Metro Detroit. And it was like, I don't know, Jerry, like maybe a 20-minute drive, half-hour drive or so?
Well, it's hard to say. It's a big city, and Dearborn Heights is right on our western border or southwestern border. And he could have been, a 10, 15-minute drive from his house. Of course, the first one that he discarded was in Dearborn Heights, and it was what, Billy?
Actually, it was the second one. Yeah. See, as Jerry and his crew were investigating this case in Detroit, they had no idea that Dearborn Heights PD was actually working on the same case for months. This case started, as I mentioned, Armstrong and his wife had moved to Michigan in 1999, like spring or so, May, June 1999. And the first person that we know he attacked was in August 1999. He attacked a couple others in December 1999. And then he killed, he killed his first person at the beginning of December 1999 that we know of. And then about a month later, he killed his second person in Detroit, and that was Wendy Jordan. And that was the one Jerry had mentioned that, interestingly enough, he picked her up in Detroit, but after he pulled along a side street and they started to have a transaction or whatever they were doing, he strangled her, he killed her. He actually took her in his Jeep almost all the way to his home in Dearborn Heights from Detroit. So that was an unusual case. Of all the people he attacked in Detroit, that was the only time he did that. He took Wendy almost all the way home and then dumped her just a couple blocks from where he was living. So really crazy.
All right, here we are back here for final thoughts after the conversation with BR and Gerald about John Eric Armstrong, the serial killer known as the Babydoll killer, also known as Opie, which is maybe, I don't know, part of what got him so much anger inside him. I don't know.
What do you think if I called you Opie for a while?
I mean... Yeah, I don't know. I guess Opie, I think for folks slightly older than us, especially, it was a bit of an insult, right? You're essentially calling someone a simpleton, right?
Oh, I thought it was just in reference to the freckles that he had. I was reading, and in the Navy, they had, I think it was when he was in the Navy, they had seen his freckles, and Opie, the character from the Andy Griffith Show, famously played by Ron Howard. That was his name, and he had freckles. Like an aw shucks type.
Yeah, like an aw shucks type. Okay. So, but I don't know. Maybe that could be taken as an insult, I suppose, still, depending on what's inside you.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Depending on what's inside you already. He was playing up that whole, as BR said, the whole warm, fuzzy, nice guy, like the big, lovable, like teddy bear type of a guy. But he obviously had psychological malfunctions. I don't want to say issues. He was a necrophiliac.
Yeah.
Which is, he's known death. I just couldn't wait to get into this. He's known death since he was 5, when his little baby brother dies of sudden infant death syndrome. And he experienced that, and apparently had a suicide attempt where he pedaled his bicycle into a busy street. And I don't know what happened. I wasn't there, but maybe he said it was an accident. But his mother said that he was most likely trying to kill himself because he missed his brother so much and wanted to be with him, which is so sad. And I'm not condoning his actions. He deliberately targeted women who are in the sex work industry. I mean, It's a classic serial killer MO to go after people in marginalized communities because they're not going to have the same level of focus or spotlight on their disappearance. And then additionally, he would leave them in positions, and he knew where they were at. He would leave them in positions where he could go back to easily have intercourse with them after he had murdered them. So his life started with death and continued with death all the way through, even to the point where BR says that really haunting thing where he only would stop violating his victims post-death when his wife smelled the death on him, when he suspected his wife could smell the death on him.
Right. Then he'd go get another victim.
He'd, for lack of a better word, a fresh one.
Wow. I mean, yeah, you mentioned he had a wife. He also had a young child.
Yeah.
As well. You know, so he really went the distance as far as like that double life thing, right? He's a complete monster inside. Killing somewhere between 5 to 11 people. Necrophiliac, and then he's this dad, shucks, nice guy with the baby doll on your license plate. Like that's, not something like, probably a tough biker is going to have on their license plate. You know what I mean? Like, it's quite shocking and disturbing, I would say, the how different those two lives were.
Absolutely. And apparently the baby doll was a reference that him and his wife would use, like a term of endearment to each other. So that's just something, like you said, that he's a warm, fuzzy family guy, even putting on the act with his wife by honing in on this baby doll moniker that they've given to each other. And so tragic that becomes his serial killer moniker.
Yeah.
Because of the license plate, and they had the picture of his Jeep with the license plate, so it became the baby doll killer. Psychologically speaking, though, I mean, he still has enough capacity for rational decisions and calculated decisions going on in his brain, because he wanted a stuffed animal, a teddy bear, that he could hold while he was being transported or whatever. And they said absolutely not, because that's clearly a media manipulation. You want this image of you out there that you're this sort of simpleton and, get like a compassionate reaction. But I wonder if that went into the decision to convict him, for life, right? Do you think that was taken into consideration, or maybe not even mentioned? I don't know, because like it's a clear manipulation of the media, so you can maybe draw on a insanity plea or something.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Or get like an innocent, I don't know, viewpoint of yourself out there. But yeah, I agree. It's probably more of an insanity thing, but I don't know. It seems like he couldn't have stopped. I guess when he was arrested, right? There was a report of him saying something like, thank God it's finally over, or something like that. I feel like that happens, I don't want to say every time, but kind of often. Like you hear that about a serial killer, and there's like some relief when they're arrested. So I feel like this guy was in that camp of like, he couldn't help himself.
I agree. It's the exhaustion of trying to cover it up, and your lies that turn into other lies that turn into other lies. And, it really is like eerily similar to the show Dexter, like the early seasons of Dexter, where he's telling a lie and he has to cover up that lie. And then the lies just become so woven, you start to lose track of what the truth was in the first place, or what lie you need to cover up to maneuver yourself out of a situation, because your whole life just becomes lies. That's got to be incredibly exhausting.
Yeah, it's a crazy story, but you can pick up the book, The Babydoll Serial Killer, wherever you get your books, and there are links in the show notes. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody. We really appreciate it.
And while you're on the site for Wild Blue Press, be sure to pick up any one of their other books that they've published. We have a really good working relationship with them, and all of the writers that they have presented to us to feature on our show have been great guests, and they have just such a great catalog of content creators over there at Wild Blue Press.
All right, everybody. Thanks a lot for listening. We really appreciate it.